Hi, I'm Miriam, and I'm going to be the moderator for this session. It's a nice small group. We have Rich with me here, going to talk about CQL with the .NET SDK.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Rich Almeida. I'm going to walk you through the CQL .NET SDK today. I'm the Vice President of Product Strategy and Compliance at FHIR. I work with a lot of the regulations like 0057 and make sure that our products align with G10 and those types of things. But my first love is actually clinical quality measures or quality measures in general. I've worked on quality measures for my entire healthcare career, which is almost 18 years now. And for about 15 of those, since meaningful use, basically, I've worked on quality measures. So this is really exciting for me. I love working in this stuff. And now with it in .NET, even better, because that's my engineering background. So what are we going to do today? Hold on a second. I'm going to highlight the latest CQL.NET SDK enhancements. We're going to walk through the demo enhancements. That's actually the majority of this presentation. I'll walk you through how to use the demo, how to create CQL, and how to get it to run. This is the first of two sessions. So this is the tutorial. We're just going to walk through. You don't have to do anything. Just watch. And then tomorrow at 1:30, we'll actually do hands-on together and fill in any gaps that we didn't do today. So we'll go through authoring and compiling CQL libraries. That's actually creating them and then compiling them to C#. We'll execute those libraries within the SDK using FHIR data. We'll walk through the different artifacts that you need to deploy to a FHIR server. And we'll actually deploy and execute those libraries in FHIR server as the example. So here's the highlights on the latest CQL SDK. And I don't specifically code the SDK like in the super technical way. I go in there with little bug fixes and things. So this has been given to me. And if there's any questions later, then I might need to check with those that work on it directly, like AWOW. So just a heads up. So the team has substantially refactored the code. If you were to compare the 2.0 branch to the main branch, you'll see substantial changes for performance, bug fixes, memory allocation, and such. We've added the ability to step through the Elm to C# process. So before it would just kind of build all the C# at once. Now you can kind of walk through if you wanted to maybe add your own C# changes, some audit logging, things like that. So it's made that easier. We've improved quite a number of data type conversions. Originally the SDK was created in partnership with NCQA, and so it was sort of HEDIS driven in a sense that only the things that they needed were there, but now we've added things for like CMS, which is built on QI core. So there's some other data types and things that maybe HEDIS didn't use. We've improved the unit test coverage quite a bit internally for the actual SDK itself. And then we're using the unit test now from the CQL IG. We also added CMS measures, so if you haven't seen those, I can show those later. I don't really focus on it, but we can look at it if that's in your wheelhouse. There's a whole GitHub repository of converted CMS measures for 2024, and we've got 99% of those complete. There's some little bit of hang-ups, and I can talk about those too if we get to that. And we're also working on a CQL to Elm, which is not in this presentation, but we want to make this .NET SDK complete, and that's the last really major piece. Right now we're using the Java tooling to convert the CQL to Elm, which I'll show today. But very shortly here, within the next few months, we should have a C# version of that. So the latest demo highlights include I've refactored all the projects for a better MS build process. If you've used the old like 1.0 version, sometimes it didn't compile because of the order of events and things. So now that's all gone, it's fixed. We've decoupled the CLI. The CLI is an example, like reference implementation, if you will. And we've decoupled it from the measures projects. We've also revised the CLI to give many more code examples, and here's a kind of an extensive list. I'm not gonna read through this, but some cool ones that I like that I did was, and I got help with, of course, is like checking if you're missing value sets for your test cases, adding test cases, pretty printing some of the output because it was just like a long string JSON form, kind of hard to read, and some command line options to actually like load files from disk and not have to have it directly built in. The major change is that I've added the measures authoring project, which is sort of an open example of how you can just go in and edit CQL or add your own and just compile a project. And the idea that I created it such that you could take that project and call it measure authoring 2 or whatever, and just start adding your own code, and now you have yet another project. So let's just pretend you have your own HEDIS or CMS or some sort of quality program. You can just build new projects very easily, and it'll all stay working and built within the SDK demo project. I've also added that the folder structures are conducive to the VS Code tooling, if you're familiar with that. I am going to show that. That's tooling that you type and it highlights the syntax or tells you what possible choices could be. And that requires a very specific like inputs folder structure. So I've redesigned this such that it works with that. And then all of the authoring projects that you create will have like sort of a CLI exe attached to it. And I'm going to explain that in a minute. And then the last thing is we moved the Elm project to the CQL project. And if you haven't looked at some of this stuff, maybe it's not a big deal, but it kind of cleans up the way things were running. So now that takes care of all the CQL to Elm conversion and then the Elm to C#, all during MS Build. Here's just a little drawing just to show you that the way that the dependencies worked. So this is highlighting some of the items that I just said before. So before the CLI directly depended on like the project that you built, the authoring project, or in the previous case, it's called the measures demo project. And now it's an optional dependency, so you can just kind of take it out. You don't have to use the CLI, you just have a DLL of all of the code that you've built. So now it's an optional dependency the other direction to the CLI tool. So it makes it more like portable. And a lot of this was thanks to maybe some of you in the room, feedback from people that use the SDK, potential customers, things like that. So we really appreciate that. And you know, the request for use of the directory structure from VS Code was one of those. The ability to use the CLI across multiple projects without having like strict dependencies was one of them. And here's a few others. So like modifications, like we got questions about how do I use this in this way or in that way. And so we try to add those types of things. And the CLI itself, I've tried to create such that it is more like almost like a production tool. You could take it with maybe very few modifications, take out all my fun, dump everything to the screen stuff, and it will actually just run measures. And you might need to add some logging and some other things, but it's more like you could copy it, just start editing, and then maybe use it in some way in production. And then we use it ourselves for development and testing. Throughout the entire CMS testing process for those measures, we run our own tooling that we've created so we can see what the outcomes are and check them against the unit tests. And actually, we've created a separate project just for that. So it's like a lot of the code that I'm going to show is used in our unit testing. So here's like just a kind of a breakdown of the steps that it takes to get through authoring to execution and to which project it aligns to. So you'll see the step, and then on to the right, you'll see which project. And like I said, we'll open this so it's not so confusing, and I'll walk you through it. But so the first thing you do is you create or add your own CQL file. So type one up and put it in a very specific folder. You could use VS Code CQL for authoring that, or your favorite IDE. And that's going to be in the measures authoring project. And then what you'll do is this next project you don't really need to do anything with. You'll just compile that project, and it will kick off the MS build for the CQL project. And what's going to happen there is the sections 2 and 3 here is it's going to build the CQL into Elm, which is still using the Java tooling, and then it's going to convert the Elm to C# and also into FHIR libraries. So then you can take those libraries and put them in a FHIR server. And that all happens in the CQL project on the right. And then the last thing is the CLI project that I was mentioning before. That's where you would execute test cases of patients, import bundles, and prove out that you have the data that you've created. So now we're going to do the fun part, which is to actually go through Visual Studio and the other tools. And look, I've put these on the slides, so you can download this for later. I'll make sure to upload this because I made changes this morning. So you'll have it for our next session tomorrow. And I can help you with that too between now and tomorrow if you have any questions. Here's my email, and we'll come back to this after. All right, so I've pre-staged this multiple resources example. That's not up there.
You're on extended desktop. Mira?
Yep. Are we good now? Okay. So I've got this multiple resources example.
Can you make it bigger?
Sure. No, in fact. There it goes. My mouse wheel usually does it, didn't do it today. So let's see. So it should be nice and big. I'll scroll down to some of the real good context. So here's just a CQL example. It's an example that was already created. I didn't create this, so we just grabbed it from some of the examples that are out there. And I'll just show you kind of the walkthrough using this example of how we take this CQL and build it all the way through C#. So this is just a look at it right now. We'll come back in a little while and show you that it actually changes, kind of proof of concept. So here's the CQL. This is using that VS Code tooling. So if you were to say, start to type something like and, then this is how you get some of this highlighting and building. Just the same, you can execute CQL using this tool. And it will go through test cases, which I'll show in a minute. And so this hopefully will run. And so we'll get an example here, lung cancer diagnosis from this condition in our test examples. And those are found over here. So I have my condition resource in a folder, observation resource, patient resource. If you're not familiar with this structure, we'll go through all this in great detail tomorrow. But today is just kind of walk through so you get a feel for what we're going to do. So then we have our patient and our smoking status. So the idea is we're going to see this exact same thing when we run this in the CQL .NET engine. So I'll close this for now. So that's our measure. So here we are in Visual Studio. You have two folders now. It looks different than if you were to use it before. The CQL folder is going to be everything that the .NET runs. All the logic to build Elm to C# and all of the fancy stuff to load value sets, that's all in there. The demo is specific to what we're doing here, so that way you can author a measure and actually use the SDK. We keep them in the same project, at least for now, because we don't have all the NuGets built yet to publish. But it's kind of fun because also if you don't like what's happening, you can kind of debug what the SDK is doing just the same. When we get to a point, maybe, 6 months from now, we'll have NuGet packages for this 2.0 release, and then you wouldn't necessarily need to have the whole SDK. You would just use the demo projects and replace the references with NuGet packages. So if you open up demo, we have a few things in here. The main one here is the the measures authoring project. This is where you're going to do all of your work. So this is that project that I said. You'll take measures authoring, and you could always copy it to another one, whatever your quality program is, and just add it right in here, and it will just compile with everything else. There's a few setup items on that, and I'm going to put some documentation together for that too, so we can follow along after this presentation. So we'll go straight to, this is where that measure lives, multiple resources example. This is exactly the same file. And here, what will happen if I was to compile this project is the first thing it's going to do is take this CQL. It's going to use this other project, CQL project, which really just has all of the Java references and the reference to the packager CLI, which is in the SDK to convert the Elm to C#. So all through MS Build, it's just going to do its thing. We'll just let it be magic for now, but we can look at it later. So I'll just go ahead and build this project. So we're done there. So now we'll go over to our C# folder and look at multiple resources example. And you can see this is the translated version of the C#. Now I kind of did this earlier, so that way it was ready to go, so we saved some time. But down here somewhere, you'll see this is going to be my edit example. So we have final and amended. So let's go back to our CQL. Just maybe make fake things like pending, save this, and we could test it even here to make sure that it compiles. And I'll go back to Visual Studio, and you can see that obviously that's not there now. We'll close this for now. And we'll recompile. Now, a lot more is going to happen this time. It's going to actually go through, I don't think I can zoom this, but it's going to go through and actually translate with the Java tooling, the CQL to Elm. Then what gets kicked off is the package or CLI. So that's this here. And that converts the Elm to C#. And we'll go back in. And there we are, our very simple edit. So everything's been converted. If there's at any point you want to ask any questions, like I don't want folks to get lost, you can go ahead and ask those. Okay, so like I said, you can take the measures authoring, just copy it, add it to this project, do a whole new quality program. All of that build process that we just went through that just showed up on the screen will compile that other project. So it should be real simple. What's changed in here, if you're familiar, is that before we had a measures project, and that kind of contained the demonstration that Evan gave last time at DevDays, and that's still here. So if you're familiar with it, it's been refactored just the same to have the same input folders, CQL. And so if that's necessary for you because you were using those, it's all still here. It still compiles. And then we also added CMS measures, which we don't have any tests for or anything, but you can see them the nice thing about this is if you want to play with a CMS measure, you could copy them into your own. Maybe you just want a couple measures to play with, copy it into the authoring project, delete everything that's in there if you want, and just start creating your own CQL and making edits. So this is the most important project. What happens is that each of the sections here, you'll see C#, Elm, all of the stuff that you need is going to be here. If you ever needed to troubleshoot, let's say that the Elm doesn't seem right, you could open up this file. And I don't claim to be able to read much of this, depending, but this is how the CQL is translated into the intermediate Elm language from which the C# is built. So you have everything available to you. Finally, you'll also have the resources folder, which will be the actual library resources that you'll load over to a FHIR server. So I'll pull that one up, and here's that example. So it's a library resource, and within it we'll have, say, parameters and value sets, important things to run the measure, and then the content. So this is the section where before, just CQL and Elm exists in these library resources. With the .NET SDK, we also have to ship out the DLL for this measure. So that's what you'll find here. That's this data for the DLL. And then we have the raw C# too, so that way it could be looked at. So it's just the string version of the C#. That's this last one here. Okay. Each one of these measures authoring projects that you want to play with, the ones below or the authoring one, will all also now be an executable. So you'll see here, program.cs has been added to all of these. What I've done is, I'm going to make this smaller just for a minute, is made this so that way it actually just calls the CLI by using just like the exact command line parameters that it needs. And you can play with these. I've added a bunch of new options, which we'll look at in a second. And you can say like where are the different folders for certain things. So for example, the V parameter is to say I have value sets over here. Maybe you don't want them in the project. You actually have this giant directory of value sets that you want to reference, and those things can be changed here. So it's really flexible now. Before, everything was sort of built into the project itself because it was just a quick demonstration that we built, but now we've realized that this is getting real use. So now you have lots of flexibility. Where are the tests? Where are the results? All right, let me walk through a little bit of the VS Code tooling that we've copied, like the idea of the directory structure, so that way you can see how this works. So that tool requires this input folder, the CQL folder, which is where the CQL files are, of course, and then test directories. And this is very important that it gets set up this way, which is also in the documentation, which I can show in a minute. So each folder needs to have like the name of the library and then the ID of the patient and then any test examples. So in our example, we have the patient example is actually patient/example. And then each one of these folders, this doesn't have to be like this, but they're broken out into folders as an example. And then we have the patient here. You could also just put them directly in the folder, but the first folder after the library always has to be the patient like identifier. So that way, anytime you run the tool here or in Visual Studio, then you'll be able to get the same results. The last thing is that results just naturally get built through the VS Code tooling into this results folder, so I've just mirrored that just the same here. All right, we're going to jump over to the CLI. Are there any questions on measure authoring project? Okay. So the CLI has been substantially revised. I'm not going to just show code this whole time, but I do want to highlight a few things. We have all of these settings, which is the command line options. This is where you can find the different command line options. So I just talked about value sets, for example, but you can change the folder for test data, pass all of this in the bottom of an authoring project, or change it. Maybe, for example, like I said, you want value sets or data tests to come from somewhere else. You can just change that in the authoring project. Or this is standalone now, so you could just use this, compile it, and set it against a bunch of folders that you've created that have nothing to do with the authoring project. So just a little bit of flexibility there. It still runs as an executable, of course, and the command line parameters are all checked to make sure we don't just have bad directories and all that. So that's a nice little tweak. And I talked about refactoring. So a lot of the questions I was getting is, I don't need all of this. There's a lot of infrastructure, even in the old one. So how do I just check the value sets, things like that? And so we've broken up this code such that it's a little more compartmentalized, separation of concerns. So you'll see things in here like, how do I get the dependencies and myself? So this is getting libraries. So if you have a starting library and a directory, it'll be able to figure out where all those things are. And my example again is collect the value sets. And so here's an example of how you would interrogate the library to find which value sets it has. And it also includes checking all of its children to make sure that the measure you've built, a more complicated one would have child libraries that it would call and have sub-value sets. In those libraries would have value sets as well. So it's a complete list. So this is the example. And then I also added like, well, we have the value sets in a directory and I know what value sets I need. Well, which ones don't match? So then I have created this missing value sets as an example. So you could try to figure out why your measures are not running. There's no code in the SDK specifically for that. It doesn't actually check to see that the value sets exist. You'll just get no results because it doesn't match. An empty value set is basically the way it works. So that needs to be done at like a CLI time, like at your runtime, to make sure that you have everything that you need. And then we have this other section of code called the resource helper. And this is all the logic to, say, load the FHIR resources. So for example, we sort of just had code by itself sitting in the SDK before. Now there's like load bundle, right? So it's a little more straightforward. So you have your bundle file and just the example. And it's just, loading a bundle seems so straightforward. You just use the other FHIR SDK. But, there's certain things that it needs to be like an actual bundle. And you might need to like build out a program, which I'll show in a second, how this all just kind of runs through, load the value sets, get everything ready first. So it was kind of all just like an inline code, and now it's compartmentalized, object-oriented, if you will. And then loading resources. So there's two ways to run the .NET SDK now. Before, we mostly had an example where you would actually run against the library that you've created. So the measures authoring will compile to a DLL, right? That's the idea. Well, it doesn't have to run off of that, and that's not how it would be used maybe in production, depending. If you have a FHIR server, for example, you would run directly off of those resources that I mentioned earlier. So the library resource, which has the C# in it, and the DLL. So if you want to run against those, we also have that example now too. And I'll show that briefly. So that's what this commented parameter is here. Let me zoom back in. So you would run against the current assembly, which is the DLL, which is great because maybe you just package up your entire application and ship it off with a CLI. But if you want to run like in a FHIR server way, then you would run against these resources instead. And so this allows you to test both. I'll caution you though that when you debug, which is going to be something I'll show in a second here, you can't debug through the resources because we don't have like the debugger, PDB, and the things that are necessary for that. So it's the same code, so you can trust it, but you're going to do all your debugging and unit testing like with the assembly itself. All right, so the fun part. Let's actually run some of this, and then I'll come back to some code because this is it's a little dry just looking at code. So what you'll do is anytime you have a project, you'll create this launch settings file, which will call all of those parameters, and I've made it so that way it only calls the library right here. So in this case, we'll run that multiple resources example. And the reason why that works is because I've already kind of pre-staged the other things that are just always static. The tests are always in the input directory, vocabulary, value set directories, where the value sets are, where do I want the results to go, what type of output. But you don't have to do that. You could just not do that here and pass in those options. All right, let's do some fun. So I'm going to run my multiple resources example. So what we've done is purposely sort of went overboard on things that you can do here. So we've added a pretty way of looking at these boxes here, a pretty way of looking at the output that comes out. So there's a tool, I forget what it's called, and it just takes like different types of like a dictionary, any object in C#, and it will dump it to the screen. And so we have a nice way to look at this, but that's not like if you're running this in maybe a production scenario, you're not going to do that, right? You're not going to just display everything to the screen. You'll put it to a file, so that's in here as well. Maybe you just want to look at it or copy and paste it. This might not be conducive. For example, here is very detailed, but pretty looking, and this is for like the developer, right? I need to see what the line codes were. I don't want to have to traverse through a file or a string of JSON. We've added this for a good example. And I use this all the time, so that way I can just look at the values when they're not right. But you may actually want the raw output of what the CQL engine is going to provide, and that's this here. So it says what method is being run. So in this case, we're running the patient context, and then you'll have the entire patient right here. And this is sort of the examples built in that way, so that way you could also put that to a file or to some UI or something like that, because you want the actual raw output. So here's like smoking status observation and all of the JSON. And so you can look through this. This is exactly the same information. Like I said, it's in pretty print. And let me get to the bottom. And then the application stops. The exit codes are correct now too. That was something that didn't really exist before. So if you have a failure, like an actual things are try-caught, but you'll have a failure number. So that way, if you do use this in some sort of like a testing tool framework or something like that, then you'll know by running multiple of these that this one failed because it doesn't return a 0, which is a success. So like really lots of logical things added to this. We'll jump back into the code for a minute, and I'll show you. So we're going to run this measure again. Get some more screen here. And let's pretend that we were having a problem with this exact situation where I made a pending edit, and I just want to see what are the actual values of what's being collected for the patient. So you could put a debugger pretty much anywhere, and we'll go ahead and kick this back off again, and it's going to stop there. And again, this is why I'm use the assembly, not the resources right now. Am I stuck? There it goes. So we've stopped on our debugger, so I'll just minimize this. And here you can highlight, just like just like old times in C#, if you're familiar with playing with .NET, you can look at what the values of these different elements are. So in the case of this particular patient, it's amended. So let's just say there was a spelling issue in my code. You know, I'd be able to figure out, and by looking at this, and see that I spelled amended wrong or whatever the example is. But you can look at the context and all the FHIR. Let's see, we'll try different ones here. The highlighting's not coming up. We're inside this subfunction, so you can only look at these things just like this. I'd have to put a different debugger in. But you can look at what the status elements were in this case and what the values were, you know, what the context looks like, which is the actual patient in this case. This is going to also show you all kinds of things about the SDK and what it's executing in the background. So you can actually like dive into, well, what does context.operators do? You know, go look at that code, you know, if there's any problems. I'm not going to say that the SDK is perfect, so if you find any of those things, please absolutely submit a PR, like you're not doing the string conversion correctly, or we're finding some of those things from time to time, or code systems not working. All right, we'll just continue this on. Any questions so far? All right. In the CLI project, there's just a little bit of code that we expect to maybe retire over time. So I'll just kind of highlight it real quick. So in this library extensions, and also I think in the resource helper, there's things like finding related artifacts and collecting dependencies. We want to maybe put that as part of the SDK so that it's not something you have to roll every time. So there's a few different things too in here. So just keep an eye on the way that the project progresses. The 2.0 branch is where we're working right now, but it'll be merged fairly soon. And you might see some of these things get retired, and it'll be because I removed it here and I gave you the new one. So that's how you'll know. Another example is, nope, actually, one second. This entire piece of code right here. So this is, we resolve the library. You don't have to, we're not going to get into what all this does. And then we process the patients. And this is pretty standard here. Go get attributes and actually create an instance and run each section of the CQL. This is another area where we have a function for this in the SDK, but we'll have multiple different versions of this coming soon as well. So like right now, it requires a version of a measure. We'll have different ways to execute this, maybe as an extension. So this is super important. Like if you remember, or if you ever worked in the other SDK, like the main branch that is, you'll see this code. This is the key to everything, is to actually get this thing to run, is to go get the attributes. What it's actually doing is it's running through each one of these sections in the C# measure itself. So this is the measure resource example again, and it's executing all of these, you know, these functions in here, the methods, depending on what it is. And it's executing them one by one and then returning the result. So if you don't want to use much of the CLI, this is where you sort of start and make sure that you have this piece of code, and it takes the input parameters, the bundle or the data, and the value sets, and it executes the library itself. So you could, if this is too much, you could just take most of what you see here that I'm highlighting, maybe a little stuff from the bottom. Let's see. Yeah, you need to invoke it. So you need this further down as well. And you could put it in the measure authoring project and just kind of kick things off on the way that you want to do it for your unit test, whatever you're creating. Oh, thank you. One thing that I didn't get to that I just mentioned is I wanted to create some unit tests. So what I'm going to do is instead highlight the old unit tests that exist. So now that we've looked at the CLI, we have also unit tests. So Evan has said to me, why would you ever just run a CLI all the time? You want to create unit tests for the files that you've created. So we still have a test measures demo unit test. And what we'll end up doing is creating an authoring one as well. But what it does is it kind of shows the examples of how maybe you would declare some of the parameters in a unit test. You maybe don't want dynamic files. You don't want to load value sets like that may change. Maybe you do, it doesn't matter. But here you can like declare the measurement period, load up some value sets, actually call, the context that I was just showing, that's that big piece of code that I highlighted, get the measure running, actually reference the measure itself directly. So this is back to the HITA stuff that was the example before, and pass the context and then say, is this in the numerator, right? So this is how you would test your CQL, like very concretely to say, I've created these unit tests for the new CQL that I wrote, and I want to make sure I know with my human looking at it that it should be in the numerator. Here's how you get those tests built. That way, in case you change the CQL, like say next year, because you've upgraded the measure, you still want these to pass, and then you can also go in and change them. So these examples still exist, and I'll create some ones just for the examples in the authoring tool soon. So follow along. So this is here. This is an example of using the resources directory that we talked about a second ago. So this is running the FHIR libraries themselves. I'm going to stop there since I only have a few more minutes because I want to leave questions and maybe some time if we need to set some things up for the next class. So any questions or Matt?
So do you have the ability to configure when the code gets generated, like anything like commenting or how the variables are named or any type of settings that are kind of customizable as it gets generated?
You can go in the SDK. I was playing with adding auditing, like logging to say where we were. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head where. I can look later and maybe give you the answer. But yeah, you would go into the SDK itself, generate the C# slightly differently to inject maybe after every section some auditing or something like that. I don't know that you could probably change the variables. It's dynamic. I'll go in there real quick. It kind of just does this ABC thing. So for every method that needs to get built, it just says the first thing that I'm going to calculate is A, and then B, and then so you see C, D, E, F, G, H. I don't think that you can change them.
And does it say it's generated from the SDK in case you copy it and bring it to another project so that someone else, if they're looking at it, knows where it came from?
No? Should we do that? And maybe version too, right? Yeah, good idea.
So using the CLI, when we are trying to run the measures, do we have to run one patient bundle at a time, or do we have the ability to run measure for multiple patient bundles?
Oh, great question. Yeah, I was going to show a little bit more about that stuff. You do not have to run it it does still run one patient at a time, but you can create multiple patients in here, and it already has the looping code. Let me find it. This library runner has become huge from top to bottom, and it starts out with the decision to run with the measures project, which is the DLL, that A parameter, or to run with resources, which is that R parameter. And then everything goes through run shared, which that's where it does the value sets, does the test directories, and it'll process test patients. So you pass in a directory of multiple patients as long as they're formatted in the VS Code format, input, that kind of what I showed earlier. Then it will just keep looping through the patients until they're done. And that's exactly how the VS Code tool works. That's why I did that. And that's all down here. And I tried to break it up so that way it wasn't just this giant piece of code. But yeah, so for each test patient, there we are.
So yeah, in one of the early slides, there was a discussion on what was coming up in the future and how the Elm, or the measure CQL to Elm, so the in progress, where's that at? So that last bullet.
I don't know the status of how close. I was told recently that it's close. Maybe Evan wants to take that microphone and answer that question, because I think he's working on it a little bit. And AWO.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
When's the CQL to Elm going to be done?
Soon.
Yeah, see, same answer.
No, really soon. I'm like 95% done. The last part that I have to do is figure out how to make sure that when a function A calls function B, I have to make sure I do function B first so that I know what the return type of B is. That's not working perfectly. So that's the last bit. And I was working on it on the plane a little bit, so it should be done relatively soon. I'm at the point where I'm testing like full libraries at this point, so I think we've done the hard part.
I'll just highlight if there's no other questions, or if you have a question, go ahead and interrupt. But CQL language is where you're going to find all the information. These are in the slides. So if you want to look at that tonight before our next class, just get a feel for this. You might need it as you decide to, if you aggressively really want to write a lot of CQL tomorrow. This tells you about how to write CQL, what are the different operators and things like that. The VS Code tooling also, these are all things, like I said, this is where you can download it, either at Git if you want to use like it raw, but it also has the instructions for installing it and downloading it in the VS Code extensions tooling. And then this is where the SDK is. And the branch, I just want to make sure you know, is to download Develop 2.0. And if you have basically what I've showed today just ready, it doesn't, you don't have to do anything for tomorrow, then we'll be ready to go and I can walk around. We'll run back through some of the stuff in more detail, actually look at, I skipped some code today just for time's sake, but we'll look at like, this is an important piece of code, this is how it works, the types of things like that, and we should be good to go to build something.
Thank you, Rich.
All right, thank you.